Hi, everyone. Welcome. We're just going to wait a few minutes for guests to come in. Okay, we'll make a start slowly. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining. My name's Esther Teichmann, and I'm joined today with Laura Pannack. And this talk is part of the Photo London Talks program. So thank you so much for joining us. Laura and I are both photographers, both artists, and Laura was invited by Photo London to be part of the Thames and Hudson Curated Talks program and really generously invited me to be in conversation with her. Laura and I met about 18 years ago, which is shocking, when she was an undergraduate student doing her BA in photography at Brighton University. And I was in my kind of first teaching job there as a senior lecturer, working with photographers, with the undergraduate students on their dissertations and their practice. And so Laura and I met there, and we'll come back to that, that was a really formative time for, I think, us both, but also in terms of thinking about teaching and the encounters that you have and how those often form, or sometimes form, lifelong friendships and relationships, and where the influence is horizontal. I think I'm as inspired and influenced by the people that I've taught, especially when they're as incredible as Laura, as hopefully I am able to give to them. So Laura Pannack, I'll do a short intro to us both. The format that we wanted for the session was that we'll each do short, kind of 10-minute or so introductions to our practice for those of you who might not know our work, and just share a little bit of visual references and talk through our making. And then we wanted to be quite a dialogic session. So we have questions for each other. We wanted to be in dialogue with each other, and then also have lots of time to open up for questions from you. So we're a lovely, quite small group of participants, which is wonderful. So do submit questions to the Q&A. We hope to have time to answer all of your questions. We'll definitely have a lot of time at the end, but do post them during the session as well, so we can pick up on those along the way and include those in our conversation. Okay, so Laura's based in London and is incredibly renowned for her portraiture and social documentary work. Laura seeks to explore the complex relationship between sitter and photographer. And I think that relationship in Laura's work between her and her subjects and how she directs, and the intensity and emotion that comes across in her really unique portraiture, is something that Laura will share with us, but I also have lots of questions about, which you may as well. Many of Laura's projects focus on the theme of youth and time. And I think that's something that's always really fascinated me, is that relationship to kind of youth as this almost the vulnerability of youth, but also that the relationship that you manage to form with subjects that, as time goes on and are a lot younger than you. When you started out, you were almost the same age, or were the same age. And I think that's really fascinating too, and something that I wanted to speak about. Laura fuses her passion for psychology and creativity, and often collaborates with a range of practitioners. And so I think that subject of collaboration is something in very different ways that comes across our practices, and our practices in all different forms as makers, educators, and so forth. Laura believes in a process built on a shared experience. Using the camera as a bridge, she curiously ventures into the process with limitless expectations with those she wishes to photograph, searching for engagement, connection, and a unique experience. And I think that experience and that intensity of connection is something which comes across in your really emotive image making and images. So I just want to speak about that a little bit more later. Laura has been extensively exhibited internationally and published widely. She's shown in the National Portrait Gallery, the Houses of Parliament, Somerset House, the Royal Festival Hall in London, and is also shown internationally. You've won numerous awards over the past 15 years, including the John Cobbold Award, the Vic Oden Prize, World Photo Press Awards, Julia Margaret Cameron Award, the Sony World Photo Award, the HSBC Prix de la Photographie, and the Camera Clara Prize, just to name a few. And so I think that relationship to showing internationally, publishing, awards, grants, but also working, of course, with an agent commercially, editorially, advertising, and coming always back to having a really sustained personal practice is something that would be interesting to speak about too, how we both in different ways kind of sustain ourselves emotionally, financially, practically, the complexity of what this chosen career means. I was born in Germany. I'm just going to keep this brief, to German father and American mother, and grew up there in southern Germany and came to the UK to study at the age of 18, more than 25 years ago. And after living in London for 20 years, I'm now based in Ely, near Cambridge, to have studio space. I'm here in the studio to have space for children, family. But I'm in London a few days a week to teach at the Royal College of Art. So I did my MA and PhD at the RCA in photography, and I now run a very interdisciplinary MA program called a Masters of Research that's quite unique in its interdisciplinarity and its relationship between theory and practice. And that's something that Laura and I will also discuss, as both of our relationship to research and writing that underpins a lot of, or kind of follows our making in different but kind of echoing ways. I'm represented by Flowers Gallery in London, and I'm just working on new work for a forthcoming show with them in the coming year. And I'm also working on a forthcoming monograph, long overdue, but yeah, at some point. Exactly. So we'll begin with Laura. Do you want to start? Is that okay now with the slide?
Sure. Yeah.
So we'll begin with Laura sharing her work. Do post questions in the Q&A, and then we can kind of either address those right now, during and after her presentation, or we can also hold on to some of them for the end. Okay, over to you, Laura.
I just want to sort of respond to your intro a little bit, Esther. And can I just say it's such a treat to see all your beautiful work behind you. It's just so nice. It just, yeah, pumps out. And I'm so glad that we got to have this discussion, because it's amazing in all the years we've known each other, we haven't done this. And I think that what's quite interesting about kind of our relationship is not just the influence that you've had on me and the teaching that you've had on me, but the fact that our work is so different. So different, but you have maintained my main inspiration in so many different ways. And I'm really looking forward to kind of unpicking your work and talking about it. I'm just going to do a very short presentation, just to kind of give any listeners an idea of who I am and the kind of work that I do and what we want to talk about. So I'm just going to share my screen. Goodness, okay. This is what the tech recce was for, wasn't it? Here we go. See that okay?
Yeah, great. Yeah.
Great, yeah. Perfect. So I've always been absolutely fascinated by portraiture, and when I was at Brighton University studying when Esther was there, I think that I particularly lent into the unpredictability of portraiture, but also the fact that you're engaging with something, you have a connection with someone, and the unpredictability of what can occur out of that moment. I'm very interested in the relationship as well between how we view images and how we all connect through an image and through a person. For me, mystery through engagement is also very important. I love the idea of a kind of unresolved narrative, and the idea of an image taking us somewhere that we could be part of. A lot of my work is with young people, in particular teenagers. I've always worked with that period of adolescence, has always fascinated me. And I've always worked with young people who are experiencing adolescence. And I think for me, it's the fact that perhaps I kind of want to stay young forever. And I can also relate to the intensity of that period of time. And it was a very important time for me. It was very transitional. And I think it also has a large role to play in the psychology of photography as well. I also, I guess I would say, have an intimate connection with the process in terms of how I kind of navigate my practice. A lot of it is about thinking, reflecting, wandering, adventuring, and building work over long periods of time. So sketchbooking and writing is a huge part of my practice as well, which I know Esther and I will discuss. And for me, that's just even like jotting out things that have happened on the day, or frustrations and kind of periods of time that yeah, I guess I'm stumbling through my practice. And one thing I started in 2011 was a blog. So this is like pre-Instagram. And it was there for a couple of reasons. One of them was to give myself a deadline, because I was leaving uni and I wanted to make sure that I produced new imagery. I remember Mark Power, my tutor, saying to me, you know, just keep shooting. And so it was once a week on a Thursday, I had to hit this deadline. The earlier posts are all incredibly just basically venting my frustration at the fact that I'm not hitting a deadline, and that I'm always late for everything, and and that I haven't got anything fresh or new. But it was a space for me to kind of I guess express my frustrations, but also what it's turned into now is a lovely journal to look back on after all these years. And I think that the power of social media does have that, but there was something about it being sort of my diary, and the writing was very important. As part of that, I would really, instead of writing something long, it was always about really just using that as a time to journal and sit and reflect. And that came either from images that I'd recently shot or shot that week. And it was an important time for me to go, what would I do next time? And also what happened 10 minutes before, an hour before, 5 hours before, 5 years before to that moment. And I think the beauty of the still image is that idea that we don't know what happened before and after. And I loved kind of filling in those gaps with the unexpected, as a reminder for myself as well. And I think it was also quite nice to see how I'd kind of reacted within that moment visually as well and creatively. So the emotional kind of experience then translated into the image. And this is something I've lent into a lot more over the years in terms of other people contributing those experiences and that journaling. And you can see on the right here, there's some children's drawings. So I often get participants to draw, paint, and write and express themselves in any way that I can. I've just been recording quite a lot of audio recently, and for me, you know, I'm just banking it. I just kind of want to be able to know that it's there to use within my editing process and use within that memory bank of a project. It feels like treasure. So yeah, the reason I included this last image is just a kind of reflection on how the majority of my process is analog. I'm very much into the idea of pushing the boundaries of kind of the physical image. I often draw and paint over images. I print in the darkroom when I can. I love experimenting with chemicals and processes, and I'm currently working with a physicist for the past 3 years who is kind of inventing all these new techniques and pushing techniques into different areas, and I find that really fascinating. However, it is really important to me that that has some kind of connection with my concept and what I'm working with. I love the idea of play, but I kind of want to elevate it into having some kind of meaning, or integrating into the work that I'm making. And so I wanted to include kind of just my latest project that I'm working on at the moment, a work in progress. And it's a very, very much kind of leaning into the idea of all these different mediums in which I can work and also in which I can journal. So I roll out a sheet of A1. I have one on my desk now, actually. I started doing it on a residency, and I just draw, paint, write notes, and they can be, you know, notes about life, notes about art, notes about things that I've heard, listened to, conversations and ideas and things that I've witnessed, or even just like to-do lists, just to get it out. I guess it's kind of an extended version of the artist's way, kind of just a big fat mess. And so, yeah, like also teaching and running workshops and getting young people involved has been a really important part of bonding with people, especially large groups. I'm used to working with very small groups, and now I'm working with larger groups, and that's a really nice way to kind of work with large groups and get different visions and ideas of kind of the stories that I'm trying to, I guess, hear, and the things that I'm exploring. I don't want to explore with ignorance. I want to kind of go in and explore by learning from the people that I'm working with. And lastly, I just wanted to talk about kind of longevity. And I think for me, I've always said, you know, that time is the best way to form a connection. I have a lot of friendships that have lasted my entire life, and I very much believe that in order to, I guess, get beneath the surface with a project, it does take time. I've been working on a project now in Stamford Hill for over 11 years, and I'm working with a number of families. I'm also extending it worldwide. And for me, I just wanted to show these 3 images because they're really important to me. One of the families that I'm working with, I first met 11.5 years ago, and the boys in either side of the table are twins. And the mother in the middle is a few years older than me. And when I met her, she had 9 children. She had, and these 2 twins were the ones that I met first. And over the years, she's had more children, and I've got to know her, and the twins have grown. She now has 16. She had another one last week. And it's been a real honor to watch the family grow, and to just see how over time my relationship with them has grown as well. And it's also given me an insight into being a mother in many ways, that's very different from the insight that I get from my friends or my family. So yeah, I just thought I'd leave that there. Sorry if I went over, Esther. I have no concept of time.
No, not at all. That was totally perfect. Amazing. Laura, thank you so much. So beautiful. I made lots of notes, have lots of questions, I mean, they're interestingly, whilst our work in some ways, of course, is entirely different and perhaps sits slightly within different contexts within the kind of photographic, if you're kind of course, I think there are interestingly also lots of interconnections, I think, which is why we're also so drawn to each other's work and inspired by each other. And I think there are elements, that relationship to kind of mystery and the unresolved and the narrative, in a way, your passion for portraiture being about what can happen in that moment, right? What can happen in that instant, which, while in a way my work is working with generally much more kind of known subjects, and I'll come to that, but you know, that I work with kind of the same subject. Well, you work with the same subjects over many years, but I don't generally kind of cast strangers, sometimes do. But it's also very much about kind of finding that moment, and that we direct in different ways. So we can probably come to that, but there are probably also quite similar ways in which we direct as well, I imagine, which, even though I've actually never seen you shoot, which is interesting, we've never been,
I've had you shoot.
Have you? Oh, interesting.
I just remembered that. Like,
oh, you came in, but that was commercial work, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was totally different. Yeah,
it was a fashion shoot. Yeah, in my sort of previous life of yeah. Okay, we'll come back to that. So thank you so much. So do post questions in the Q&A, and we'll kind of come to those. I'll now jump into my PowerPoint. 1 second. Okay. Here. So I just wanted to share some fragments of work, because you may know Laura's work better than mine. And so I work, I'm just going to look at my notes. My practice is always kind of centered around the photographic. Much like Laura, I'm really interested in the materiality of the photographic, the process. So this is a weird doubling where I'm in the space that this is a picture of my studio, but I'm interested in that material making, whether it's kind of working in the darkroom, whether like these works here, working with cyanotypes, painting, sculptural pieces. But at the heart of it, there's always this encounter with the photographic materiality, whether it's working kind of analog or working across analog and digital, or even within CGI with moving image. But there's this encounter of always thinking also about the slippage between photography and other mediums. So whether it's the still and moving image, kind of photography and painting, photography and sculpture. At the moment, I'm working a lot with 16mm filmmaking. So my practice moves across the still and moving image, collage, and painting. And I'm always trying to create kind of alternate worlds. And so we can talk about that a little bit as well. This sort of fictional space that I think I'm always trying to create. Laura, in some ways, yours is perhaps more anchored in the real, but also is a fantastical space in some ways that you're creating. mine in a way is maybe more within the kind of imagined world. And I'm always interested in blurring autobiography and fiction. So I think where Laura is maybe telling her story through the stories of others, I think I'm perhaps much more, I might not be right, but I think I'm much more perhaps overtly drawing on my own autobiography, but always fictionalizing that. So I'm interested in how we mythologize ourselves, our pasts, and how the personal narrative and the collective can kind of become these palimpsests and echoes of one another, which I think actually is perhaps in some ways quite similar within our practices, but through different forms. I'll keep moving on with slides. So here are just some details of these textile pieces that I'm working on at the moment. That haven't yet been shown kind of publicly. We'll be working for the next exhibition on these. Some details. And these are some stills that might show a fragment of later of a new 16mm film piece. So here, the subjects that I'm often working with are my kind of longest term subject is my mother here at the bottom. And my father died almost a year ago exactly. And in that past year, I've been filming my mother's face quite close up. My mother's body and also her face, and often turned away subject, has been in my work since I started making work kind of as a teenager. But I've been kind of looking at her face quite closely through 16mm, through moving image in the past year. And then my daughter is 4, and if we're lucky, she'll leave us alone for the next hour, but she might break in. So I've been working with her over the past 4 years as well. But I've also been working with friends and other subjects. This is Frankie, a life model that I've worked with for many years, who just had a baby in December. So I've been looking at the maternal body for a long time in different ways over many years. Initially, it was photographing my mother from the position of a child. So I was always interested in the maternal body as lover, as home, and as origin. And that kind of echoes throughout the work. And then there's been this slippage as my sisters, I'm middle one, I've got an older sister and a younger sister, as they became mothers. My first sort of niece was born 16 years ago now. Madness, seems like yesterday. And I think that sense of becoming a mother through not necessarily biology, through friends, through sisters becoming mothers, I was really interested in that experience of motherhood as well. So in my work, I'm always interested in this slippage of bodies, sisters' bodies, the mother's body, the lover's body. We can come back to that a bit more. But really, let me press on. This layering and this idea of sort of fragmentation and staging is throughout the work as well, especially within exhibitions. So I think most instinctively, I work in exhibition form. I find it clearly, as I can only ever finish exhibition sort of zines and catalogs, very difficult to kind of say, right, now there's enough work and I can finish this book. Poor publishers. So I find the sort of exhibition space, I think the sort of fleetingness of it, but also the physicality of it is, for me, the most kind of instinctive way of working and kind of testing that out in layers in the studio. So this is an installation where the backdrops, I've been working with backdrops in images, but then also brought them into the exhibition space, are painted onto. So I work with 5:4 and 8x10 plate cameras primarily. So with very slow process of making where very few images are made. And then here the backdrops are painted into, so they're photographic UV prints onto canvas, and then they're painted into. And then the prints, the photographic prints, are primarily darkroom prints that I've made myself. So this is a C print from a large format negative of my mother in a swamp in Florida. And that's just a kind of straight darkroom print. So here's some further examples of work. I think all of my work is thinking about our bodies, especially female bodies, but really all of our bodies as sites of knowledge production. And I'm trying to reimagine spaces and encounters, specifically female spaces and encounters. And I think particularly, since becoming a mother, but also in this really, difficult time that we're in a time of political and ecological unrest, instability, and extreme violence, especially what we've been witnessing in the last few months. I'm interested in the creative process and the work of art as a space of speculative imagining, and perhaps as world making and resistance. And that might be quite large claims. I don't think it's that art perhaps can necessarily change, or is the space to change things per se, but that sense of imagining other ways of being, I think, is quite important to then be able to act on that as well, kind of in the world. I'll just, so this is another piece that has been in the V&A collection. It's a kind of 180 piece that's 180 wide, and is a sea print that's painted into this image of my parents. So I'm interested in this sort of slippage between myth, autobiography, and fiction, and how they are interwoven and can create alternate realities. And I think here, like turning away from the real, turning towards the fantastical, is not an escape from the real, but perhaps a way of refusing to live within the constraints of our current society and imagining a different world or a different way of being. So here's some. This isn't a collage piece, this is just a kind of scattering of kind of recent images from the last few years. This is a spread of a publication that was in an exhibition where there was short stories, and Laura and I will talk about those different approaches to writing. Writing is kind of quite central in my practice as well, where it's always this sort of fictionalizing of memoir, of lived experience. Here are just a few more installation images of more sculptural work. So boats and water appear throughout the work. I'm interested in sort of liquid space, quite literally, but also metaphorically, the kind of womb-like space, the space of the dark room, swimming, kind of a space of being physically decentered, a space of where we can maybe escape and become other. And so these are bronze casts of seaweed and boats that I grew up kayaking and canoeing with my family, and wild camping throughout the summers, as well as kind of swimming every day, competitive swimming. And then, so that kind of immersion in water is kind of also a theme that's throughout the work. And this is further installation images and a live string quartet score that was performed in one exhibition, well, in several exhibitions, that was a score to a film piece. So I might look at some clips of moving image later, but this is an installation of one moving image piece that had the string quartet score, composed by Deirdre Gribben, who's an Irish composer that I've worked with for many years. And here's some other just fragments of work that I've been working with recently. Mother and my little sister. Okay. I think I'll close it there. These are film stills. That's a film still that has a voiceover story. That's one of the only pieces where the narrative, the written story, came into the piece rather than kind of existing as a separate written text in Search of Lightning. So it's filmed in the swamps right near where I grew up, and then has this voiceover narrative about the sort of physical impacts of grief as a voiceover. And this is most recent filmic piece, other than the 16mm that's in progress, but most recent finished film piece that was in collaboration with my partner and sometimes collaborator, photographer Christopher Stewart, that also taught Laura and is a huge fan of her work, called Constellations. That was a 2-year public engagement research project that was funded by the Wellcome Trust, the Wellcome Collection. So I'll close there. I'll stop sharing, and we have 2 questions for Laura. So Laura, do you think we should, I think we'll come to, because a really great question in the chat, come to this question first, and then we can, by Sophia, and then we can open up to our questions for each other. Does that sound good? And we can also go back to our slideshows if that's good.
Yeah, sure.
Okay. I can read it for you. So Sophia has 2 questions for Laura. How do you use a camera which would easily be a barrier between sitter and photographer as a bridge? That's really interesting in terms of thinking about, rather than alienating or kind of creating distance, in a way, perhaps that's a tool for intimacy in your work, and I think my work in a different way as well. What do you mean when you mentioned a connection between adolescence and the psychology of photography? Those are great questions. Thank you, Sophia.
Thanks, Sophia. I mean, actually, like, I can kind of twist that question to ask it to you as well, Esther, because I think, yeah, there's 2 things that relate to things that I was thinking about. So the first question, the first answer is actually, I'm going to quote, not quote, but reference Olivia Arthur, who told me something so beautiful once, where she said she uses a Hasselblad as well, and so she looks down, so she kind of stands up and sort of holds it there and looks down, and apparently somebody told her that it's like bowing to the person that you're photographing, and I love that so much. It's such a nice gesture. But for me personally, the reason that I shoot analog for so many reasons is that the young people that I'm working with are fascinated by it. So it's an instant connection. It's a magic box that they probably haven't seen before. And so the more hesitant the person is, the more they kind of lean in with curiosity, I find. So one of the first things that I do before I photograph anyone is I show them the viewfinder and I get them to look through and photograph each other. I've also got a trick for kind of under 7-year-olds or 8-year-olds where I take the film back off to save myself money and get them to shoot as much as they like. But yeah, like for me, it's really important that that becomes kind of this shared love of this magic thing. And then in answer to the second question, I guess for me, adolescence is so rich with intensity, change, transition, relationships with both yourself and other people. And I find that in particular, it interests me in how we present ourselves to others. And actually, I wrote my dissertation on the mask and presentation and how we present ourselves. And Esther was my dissertation tutor. And I just found our conversations at that time so fascinating. And, you know, your writing has always been so powerful, Esther. And I think what kind of connected me to the way in which you taught me was also the way that you brought philosophy in, the way that you brought psychology in a very visceral way and visual way. And for me, adolescence just holds so many stories. And it's a rare period of time that I can remember for the moment. I kind of can't remember much before that. And I also find just working with young people during that time can be very transitional in a helpful way. I, as an adolescent, really lacked self-esteem. I struggled a lot with bullying, with kind of just being comfortable in my own skin. I just felt really uncomfortable. And so I think that when I watch young people grow an interest in photography or form some kind of interest through the practice and the process that we're going through, I do see their sense of self, their self-esteem, their connection with others build. And yeah, that's kind of what I find quite interesting. They're kind of presenting their childlike self, their kind of playful self with their creativity, but also with a sprinkle of self-awareness, or this sort of maybe this tug of war between how they should conform and present themselves to the camera and how they kind of just want to kind of push against it. So yeah, that's my, but I want to to you afterwards. Go on. What are you going to say?
Okay. Well, no, I have a question that builds on Sophia's question, because I think that you know, that vulnerability of your subjects, and yet of adolescence, and yet the images are such that they have so much agency and they seem so comfortable, and that and I think that's where the power is in your images that really hold us and captures us. And I was wondering
about say that, because like people just used to say to me in the past, God, everyone in your picture looks so miserable. And
except they're also beautiful. No, I mean, I guess that's what I was interested in terms of,
I saw it as people just not pretending to be happy. And for me, it was like, yeah, it's really important to, I've always been awful at meditating, and I always saw when, you know, that just that stillness in that moment with those people was more sort of a concentrated meditation. I think they were miserable, and I'd sort of say, don't smile, just, you know, concentrate on that leaf for a sec and let's be here. And it would just, yeah.
No, that was my question, really. If you can tell us a little bit, and this might be hard, I'm not sure I could exactly describe this myself and from my own work, but two parts. How do you kind of cast your subjects, if you like? How do you choose them? How do you encounter them? And I know it's obviously different for different projects, where some, like the family Stamford Hill, is ongoing, but how do you, that initial contact perhaps, or that initial finding, or some that are more fleeting, that are just perhaps the one-time encounter, how do you know, and what is that kind of
I mean,
asking.
I think
Yeah.
it's just like dating in the way that kind of like there's some people you see and you're like, oh my God, you know, amazing. I remember Junie Woodward, who's an amazing photographer, and I went to the races because she always photographs events, and we separated. I was like, why don't we separate for a couple of hours and then come back together? And out of all the hundreds of people there, we'd both photographed the same 3 people, you know, out of every, because you know, some people just have a great face, and there's a lot of people whose work is about those beautiful faces or those interesting faces. And I really want to come back to that because I want to ask you something about the work that you're working on. And I think that for me, it's kind of the casting process is about that connection and engagement. So there's some people that are growers, you know, you meet them and you start photographing them and you're like, wow, you know, like we're really learning a lot about each other. Or sometimes it becomes about kind of the relationship between people. So you might start photographing one teenager and then you meet their group of friends and then you're like, oh wow, the relationship between you two is super interesting. I just want to like ping on that before I forget, because I'm gonna forget, is, you know, I found it amazing that you're photographing your mother's face, and I think that's so interesting. And I wondered what you've learned from about her and about your relationship from looking at her face in a different way. Because like you were saying earlier, I can't photograph people close to me. So I think that in the same way that, you know, we're discussing vulnerability, you know, for your mum to do that, that's such a vulnerable thing, but such a beautiful gift. And so I wonder what it's brought up and opened up for you.
Yeah, no, it's interesting because I think I'm not sure that I could photograph in the way that you do. You know, it's interesting. Although I have to say I have run after a few people, you know, like wait,
the woman with the long hair. I remember she.
Oh yeah, Frankie, she was a life model in Brighton, but also Michelle's not on the wall behind me now, but she was like a kickboxer that I met in Bondi Beach and just like ran after and then spent a week with her photographing. Just like she's like half Japanese, half Swedish, and she's like professional Thai kickboxer, or was at the time, you know. Yeah, so I mean, occasionally it's like, oh my God, like that I have to kind of meet that person.
And was it a visual thing, like when you saw her, or was it just
you
like
know what it is? I think because it's similar, the dancer that I've worked with several times, Sophia Wang, was kind of similar. I saw, well, although I saw her perform, it wasn't just seeing her walk past, I saw her perform and then was like, and I'm trying to think what it is. It's not just yes, they're visually arresting women, but they're also women who are incredibly comfortable in their bodies in a way that is, or that, yeah, that has something to do with strength, and not just strength as in, yes, they're both kind of physically incredibly strong, like Sophia's a rock climber and the kind of contemporary dancer, and like the other's like kickboxer, but it's something else. It's something, yeah, I can't quite put it into words. Or
is that something that you admire or something you relate to, or both?
I think it's about almost like, it feels like this isn't quite the right way of saying it, but there's no vanity, or not, vanity isn't the right word because that has so loaded kind of negatively, or kind of also gender. There's like this sense of
very
like
humbling.
Yeah, or this like intensity in how they kind of move or in their bodies, where I think it's like, as you were saying, like I'm drawn to it, you know, like in a way that is both probably desiring, but also
I think
like,
it's something attractive
yeah,
to see. Like when
yeah.
I think of the people that kind of I connect with, both as friends, lovers, or people that I admire, or even actors and actresses, it's people like, I love Kate Winslet, like just like legend. And it's people that are just so present in the moment and so comfortable in the moment. And it's not a kind of peacocking.
Yeah, exactly. It's not about a kind of idealization of the female body in the way that's
it's a
comfort that we're presented with, but it's something that's kind of, that's owning, I don't know, it's hard to, and I think that relationship to my mother, it's interesting in, I think like the first person I really photographed was my little sister at a time of adolescence, when I think in a way also to kind of try and show her herself at a moment when actually she was, you know, really struggling and had quite severe eating disorder at the time, and I think it was almost that sense of trying to be like this, what you're seeing or who you, it isn't, you know, this is, and trying to kind of show her that strength in herself through the kind of photographic, and to perform something together, and to kind of hold on to something that was and then we've worked kind of together, you know, since then, with both sisters and with their children, but also with my mother. I guess it's always, for me, it's always about, in a way, a self-portrait as well, you know. And I think also, as my mother's aged and as I've aged, I see more and more, you know, when I see her body, it's my body, and this is kind of mirroring and this sort of folding onto each other, and especially since I've had Ada. And I think it's interesting, that sense of like that we don't notice ourselves, you know, aging in that way until I look back and I'm like, oh my God, that's my mother, you know, at the age that I am now. And yeah, but there's something about that body that's the most familiar, the most intimate, that is in a way my home, my first, you know, kind of space of.
It felt to me like,
Yeah.
when you said you were capturing it, it felt like losing your father sort of triggered this idea of loss, and you were like, I need to preserve
Mm,
my mum. I need to like
yeah.
capture her as much as I can to hold
Yeah,
her.
definitely. And I think in that way, that's always been my relationship to photography, you know, in the sense, when my little sister's life was sort of quite severely endangered, it was like holding on to that. But I think also that sense of, yeah, different moments that sort of triggered that relationship, on almost like the childlike rehearsal of imagining your parents' death, and kind of rehearsing that to kind of try and imagine and come to terms with it, which I think you kind of do at different stages of a child. That photography has that, of course, the kind of holding on to the subject, but also, as you say, like it gives you time, and it allows you, I think Sophia's question of the bridge, you know, that it allows you to look, it allows you to be with that person in an extended way, and to be with them quietly, to be with them without anything else, like without any other kind of agenda, any other than to just be there and look at them. And often my subjects are sleeping or kind of relaxing or have their eyes closed, and it's that sense of they're kind of falling into themselves, and I'm allowed to look at them. I would say it's like middle child syndrome, where like the only way to get like my mother's, not just kidding, but like her attention was to be like, you know, is to like kind of go on a canoe trip at 5 a.m. to get a sunrise picture alone. But I think it's that sense of, it becomes this project that we're both on and we're both doing. And interestingly, my whole family, whilst not artists or from background in that way, like kind of really have always come on board, like, just, yeah, no question, we'll kind of do whatever, and we'll be naked, and we'll be, you know, in this location for the work, which is sort of kind of quite hilarious, but also really kind of moving. It's sort of like, okay, like, yeah, which is interesting.
Because I could never have that with any of my family members. Like, my sister hates to be photographed, and my mother wants to be photographed. She asked me to photograph her. I remember her saying to me a few years ago, I'm going to die soon. Why have you not taken more pictures of me? But yet, for me, it's almost like there's nothing to unravel, or I can't force myself to have the discipline to have that still time with them. It doesn't feel like a true quest for connection. And maybe that's just because I sort of see my bonds with them forming in different ways, like, you know, going for a walk or something like that, I feel reveals more. I don't know, it's
interesting.
very. And then
I mean, maybe I wonder, is that because, I mean, I don't know how much we'll talk about this or not, but in a way, as if I remember correctly, like, actually, I almost often think your parents' careers and their backgrounds, it's like your work is almost like this mixing of the two, right? Your mother was kind of a youth social worker, right? And like really kind of politically active in kind of young women's rights.
And she used to paint, used to draw. And
okay, I didn't know that about, okay, that's really interesting. And your father is a photographer, or was
and actually to photograph him has been a really interesting process, because we have a very on-off relationship. I'm not very close to him, but I've grown up in the darkroom with him. And so over a decade ago, I suggested that to kind of build our relationship, we started photographing each other.
Amazing.
And I kind of had this like very pretentious name for the project, of something like Blood and Silver or something like that, because the silver nitrate. But it would become this kind of like practice to avoid awkwardness, because I find my relationship with my dad really awkward. And we would just, and I remember the first time it happened, something very powerful emerged, where I was learning how to use a 5.4 for some bizarre reason, and this leads on to the question that's just come in. I asked him to take his shirt off, and I never really, like, my relationship with my dad is awkward. I don't know why I did it. Probably because I just thought it'd make a more interesting picture. And I was fumbling with the camera and it was really awkward. And there was this kind of moment of just like where I waited for ages to take the picture. And it was so intense. It was like and it was like, for the first time, I was like seeing my dad, because he always poses in photographs in a very like Austin Powers 80s way. And so I really wanted to break that down. And so I was deliberately shooting on 5.4 because I wanted him to be still and to go beyond that awkwardness of that pose and just be. And it was a weird moment. And I know that he felt it as well. And then afterwards, he said, wow, that was really weird. It's like I photograph the outside and you photograph the inside. And I thought that was really interesting because he's technically so good and so good at making people look good. Like, he was part of that 80s era. He shared a studio with Bailey and, you know, all those people. And so, you know, he really resented the fact that I started photography, because he would talk about the rule of thirds and I'd be like, what fucking rule? You know, like but that kind of idea of the body really leads on to a question that's kind of come in, and I want to ask you from the audience.
Yeah, I see that.
And it says, is nudity in your work referring to a future way of being, or are there some historical perspectives on gender in it, or maybe because you particularly work with women, so
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, Yanis, thank you. And also Abby, hi, lovely to see you. Thank you for joining. Both questions are great. I'll come to those as well.
I'll ask the next one next.
So Yanis, yeah, no, it's an interesting question, and one that I'm sort of never quite sure actually in terms of what sort of truthfully the answer is. I can have different kind of rehearsed ones, but I think there's multiple things. I think I'm really interested in looking at the body. I'm really interested in that timelessness, I suppose, of flesh, you know, of like thinking about, I know Laura and I had created some questions that we might ask each other, and one of hers towards me, for both of us, really was like, what would we be if we weren't kind of artists and photographers? And I think who knows if I would have like gotten through the training, but in a way I would have also probably liked to be a doctor, and probably like there's something about, you know, a surgeon probably, or so there's something about dealing with flesh and the physicality, and the way I kind of direct is quite physical, is kind of sculpting and moving the body, which you kind of also have to be quite intimate with the subjects to be able to do that. And that, of course, it's, you know, different. The children less so, because they're kind of moving all the time. But I think there's something also, absolutely, I'm interested in this kind of female world. Even, sometimes men have been in my images, but then it's only been my father occasionally. And that's an interesting story, which I can totally, in a different way, relate to, that Laura was saying, beautiful story. And my ex, I was photographed for many years. That was complicated as well for different reasons. So I think it's also very much, though, and this sounds kind of strange now, in that current moment is showing Germany in a very different light to, I think, the sort of fantasy I had growing up in the 80s and 90s in Germany, where there's, I think now, the sort of fascism, I suppose, and state control is kind of coming to the surface when we think about kind of freedom of speech and so forth that's being infringed. But I think that the Germany that I grew up in, you know, this sort of or my mythologizing of it in my own memory, was very much one of, we were naked all the time in the summer. I grew up in the Rhine Valley in the Black Forest, so it was incredibly hot in the summers, these like crazy heat waves, and there was a lake in the forest right by my house that we spent all summer in, and just all the kids and sort of parents of it, like, we were nudists. It was just that we just didn't have clothes, you know, in the same way as like there being a specific, and that culturally has changed totally, and that's not a bad thing. It's a much more multicultural.
My upbringing was quite similar, very much.
Oh, so interesting. Yeah, no, that's really fascinating. So I think there's you know, I loved, one of the biggest pleasures is swimming naked, or the memory of that, even if I kind of get to do it less. So that sense of just the freedom and sensuality of that, of the kind of, and I think, And I think it was also a house, for example, like my parents still live, or my mother still lives in the house that I grew up in, was born in, and it's an old kind of farmhouse in Germany that they renovated, and they had the whole upstairs be open plan. They thought it'd be a great idea to not have any walls and just like this huge open plan bedroom. They're like total hippies, but like kind of academic hippies. So like my sisters and I did have our separate rooms, but actually the three of us slept in one room, and then my parents had this gigantic bed that everyone would heap in on. So that sort of boundarylessness of bodies and of relationships, for good and for bad, it turns out, as an adult, it's not great to not have good boundaries. But I think that is something, and I think now as a mother, like my relationship to my daughter is also very kind of physical, and she's 5 in the summer and she still nurses avidly. And I had sort of, because my mother let us sort of feed until we wanted to stop. Like, so I think that that sort of sensuality and physicality of motherhood, of kind of sisters. I'm incredibly close to my sisters. I was saying we all slept in one bed. So I think that's there, but I think it's also the beauty of looking at people, but the sort of out of timeness. So absolutely also trying to rethink in some ways our historical references, where it's the female body, but always through the gaze, or not always, but through male painters. Or I'm interested in those references, but kind of shifting them, even if sort of slightly. I'm always interested not in kind of a nostalgic relationship to photography historically, or kind of painting historically, but something that cuts that. So it's out of time, but it's also very much of the kind of current moment, if that paradox makes sense.
It connects our work a lot, actually, that sense of timelessness. And I think that it makes sense, like what you're saying about kind of that timelessness, because what I love about your work is how many different kind of layers there are to it, and how it's so kind of driven by painting as well, and kind of working into the work, and how that changes the sort of timelessness of the work in a sense, because you're stripping back the clues. And I think that yeah, like I think that's one of the powers of your work, is that sense of timelessness, and maybe by removing those distractions, we see the body more. You know, we get to kind of connect with the flesh a little bit more. But I'm interested in what you were saying about how you direct people as well, and I wondered if, you know, how does that relationship that you have with those people change the intimacy as well, because you're working with people that you're so intimate and close to. So taking on that role of almost like a director, an artist, or as you said, physically moving their body, is there a power dynamic? Is there sort of yeah, like how does that change things?
It's interesting. I think there's something about, and it was really beautiful, the story that you told about your dad, because even though, you know, I was very in some, like my father was there, and we, you know, throughout my life, but we had a very kind of complex relationship too, and that he was not very good at expressing his emotions. But, you know, so I was like very, very close physically and emotionally to my mother. I realized more and more incredibly similar to my father, even though, so his whole visual frame of reference actually almost, I realize, is what I'm sort of creating in my work. He loved watching thunderstorms at night and bats. You know, he's the one that loved kind of canoeing and kayaking and wild camping. And so there's something, I mean, it's kind of a fusion of both of them, and in not in terms of profession in the way that maybe there is in your work, but kind of emotionally and aesthetically in terms of the kind of world that they created for us. But I think the way in which I could sometimes feel close to him is like being like, okay, let's like build this boat up together for this shoot. Or he was an engineer and also an academic, but he could like fix anything and make things. And technically, you know, he had worked for Kodak as a engineer and kind of manager in Rochester, New York, uselessly before it was any use to me in terms of film or anything, but that sense of sort of the mechanical, or trying to connect and have intimacy through, like, he would assist often, so he would help me set up, or help me, you know, in terms of kind of set builds, or technically at home,
It's like teamwork.
Yeah, that sense of kind of having, okay, if we don't really know how to connect kind of verbally or hanging out casually, but it's like this project that I think like everyone can participate in. And I think it feels like an adventure, doesn't it? It feels like this way in which it's like, okay, everyone can, even like the little kids, like my little sister's son, the older son, he's actually the best at like coming up with directing ideas sometimes, where it's like, okay, it's my shoot, Damian, like, can I, yeah. But he's always right, you know, he's always
Yeah,
like,
yeah,
oh,
of course.
amazing. You're like, and he totally gets my work almost like. So yeah, there's something interesting about that. I've gone off topic, but
I
no,
want to segue onto, because it's very relevant to Abigail's question.
Abby's question, yeah, absolutely.
It's a really nice question. She said, a question for you, Esther. You mentioned places in the work, places of your childhood, womb-like. There are images of various landscapes, caves, and oceans. These worlds are fantastical and distinct, and a distinct mood in each work. Could you possibly elaborate on the importance of place in the works?
Yeah.
And it made me actually, just before I kind of sort of open that up, it's sort of, I want to add this bit on where I had an amazing dinner with one of my favorite photographers of like all time, Joachim Eccleston, and he invited me to his place, and I'm going to go there at some point. But he said that he showed me pictures of his house, and he said, I've built my house to basically be sort of, he said, it's almost like when I create pictures and images, they're worlds that I want to live in. And so I've built a house that looks like my photographs. And I think that's quite relevant to sort of her question of like, are these places that you feel comfortable, that you have nostalgic memories of, and how do they shift and change as well, like once you photograph them?
No, absolutely. I think that's a beautiful analogy and really hitting the nail on the head. I think in some ways, all of my work is trying to kind of recreate the home and the adventures as a family that we went on, that, yeah, nostalgically in that way. So it's very much the sort of color palettes or the colors of the house that I grew up in. My parents painted the house on my 2-year-old suggestion, a deep purple with like gold and pink window edgings. It's like, who asks a 2-year-old? But inside it was all, you know, my mother was amazing at kind of redoing academic and taught literature, but she was amazing at with like found bulk garbage. They didn't have a lot of money, but she would make everything kind of really beautiful, like would redo furniture and like amazing textiles and things like that. And the garden was always like really colorful and incredible. But I think that relationship to location is, on the one hand, I'm interested in a lot of the swamps and the caves are right in the landscape that I grew up in. Like an hour from my house, there's a kind of cave landscape of where my father actually grew up, of like literally hundreds of kind of caves that I've then tried to get access to and kind of hire or get early morning access to before public was allowed in. But then also when I've been in other places in the world, whether on residencies or visiting, a lot of the work is also photographed in Florida, where my now 101-year-old grandmother still lives. So my grandparents, my American grandparents, were from New York, but had then retired. You know, didn't go back and forth anymore between New York and Florida, and so we always go there kind of once a year. So in a way, I've always made work wherever my family is and wherever I am. So whether that's kind of staged work in the studio at home or at college or wherever I could use studio spaces, or in Germany at home, or also in the landscapes I was in. So there are kind of several landscapes that reoccur, but they all like look like the same, or like they could be part of the same world. So that sense of geographical specificity isn't important, and in fact isn't kind of, you know, titled or addressed. A lot of the caves are also when I was in residency in Australia, or when or the seaweed is found all over the world when I was in residency in Ireland or holiday in Cornwall.
Does that mean that if you did a residency in a city, you'd find it really hard to make work in the city?
Well, I think I would use studios then. Do you know what I mean? Or you know, sometimes on the edges, find landscapes, of course, where the edges of things have water or have you know, or small, like, you know, there's small spaces even in like Kennington. You know, I lived in obviously central London for over 20 years, and only just kind of recently left. So I think but there I would use my flat as the studio. I made a lot of the images that you saw in the flat, really, with painted backdrops, with kind of set builds, with different things. Yeah. But yeah, so yeah, thanks, Abby. That's a really great question. So I think it's that sense of wanting to, this sort of paradox of both looking for the familiar, but also the kind of otherworldly. And I think what connects them, whether it's sort of beds or swamps or caves, is there's this kind of wet space, if you like, or the allusion to, obviously beds aren't necessarily, but the sort of sense of a sort of dream space, or a kind of womb-like space of sort of that feels like Orphic, like kind of Orpheus, underworldly like, or otherworldly. Yeah. Laura, I'm
And that,
just aware of time, and I wonder
yeah,
if I'm just thinking about the audience, many of whom I don't know, so thank you for joining. But I was just wondering if it would be interesting, but you might have different questions you want to speak to. But I was just thinking about, it's quite a sort of pragmatic question, but I was thinking about how you sustain yourself. You know, what support mechanisms you have in place. You work fully as a freelance photographer, very much as opposed to myself that sustains myself financially as an academic. So a much more, perhaps less risk kind of, to a certain extent, perhaps a more stable, have chosen, you know, that has its setbacks though too, in terms of, yeah. But you work fully as a freelance photographer and you combine these long-term amazing personal projects with incredible editorial and commercial commissions, which you manage to all give a similar kind of feeling to, which is really unique and unusual. And you work with agents as well as publishing and showing your work internationally. And I was wondering about what support mechanisms you have in place, you know, to sustain yourself emotionally, financially, practically, you know, whether that's,
say I've got a really good
yeah,
therapist, basically.
right.
Yeah, do you know what? I always wondered, like, why am I such a deeply anxious person? And then I was like, oh yeah, because I've been freelance since the age of like 16. Um, it's
Yeah.
really, I think my mum has always taught me limitlessness, and
Mhm.
that's one thing that has kind of like for example, when COVID hit, I probably had my best year because I just like dug deep and was like, how can I survive? It's that survival mechanism. And my survival mechanism has always been kind of, I guess, related to creativity, and how to connect with people. So for me, it's kind of like there's so many people out there to hire me. Like, how do I connect with those people? Like when I was at uni, I handmade Easter eggs, you know, using balloons, and put a little kind of print inside and sent them to 10 people that I wanted to commission me. And like, it probably arrived a complete mess, but I felt like it was memorable and it was me making an effort. And I think, you know, every time that I look at my practice, I see how it's changing and how I'm prioritizing my time and how that's changing, and also how different that would be if I had a child. And like, I mean, I babysat last night and I couldn't even send an email. And I was like, how do mothers do this? Like, and I had someone else helping me. So I was like, what the hell? So I guess I've kind of transitioned more into teaching one-to-one. That's one thing that happened kind of, I would say, a couple of years before COVID. And that allows me to work with people quite intensely. I've sort of built a program. I have about 8 people a month, and I do one-to-ones with those. And I just find that a lot more productive, instead of teaching in a university, because it becomes like much more of an intimate process. And I'm very much kind of, I guess, kind of working on all the different Swiss Army knives of a Swiss Army knife kind of sections with people, whether that be kind of their editorial transition, their personal projects, access, emotional support, like
That's
money,
amazing. I didn't realize
market
that.
yourself, like, and I've learned that through other people as well, and I'm continuously learning that. And it's very much like a soundboarding thing with a very kind of like, I guess what you'd say, practical and kind of like progressive template. So that's something that I'm really interested in, and I get pleasure from, and I make money from, and it's flexible. I'm always chasing commercial work, and I think that I've always been told that it's impossible to be a commercial photographer and an artist, and I've always felt a kind of lack of satiety in both. I've always felt like I've never really achieved one or the other successfully. And then I just basically get reminded, you know, of the fact that I love what I do. And if I am struggling financially, or if I don't have a show in a great gallery, or, you know, if I don't get a commercial job, I have to remember that I still wake up every day inspired. I still wake up every day after like how many years just being like, I have the best job in the world. And so I'll never stop pining for that and trying to balance that. And I think that it does force you to be a bit more creative. And I'm fortunate enough to be able to take on the work that I want to take on, rather than just take on everything. So, and I think that the strength of that is about recognizing how generous people are around you as well. And I'm very drawn to people that are very driven but not competitive against others.
Mhm.
And I find that then we have this community where if I can't do a job, I hand it to someone else. If I'm working and mentoring with someone, I want to introduce them to editors. I want to introduce them to people. And I think that that's just like human decency and recognizing that if someone else gets a job, that is life, and better it be a decent person and a decent human being than someone you don't know. So that works both ways. So people, invite me to join programs and do talks and do workshops. And I had a commercial job recently, and that just came through a friend who spoke to a friend who saw my work. And then, do you know what I mean? So it's really tough. Like, it's not easy. But I think the thing for me is the instability and the constant chasing, the exhausting, constant trying to tread water. I don't know if I could do it if I had a child. And I think it's that flex. But yeah, sorry, that was a super long answer.
No,
But
it's really important. Yeah, I think it's really important to talk about those aspects of our careers kind of quite openly in a way, because it's something that maybe at, university or in arts education isn't kind of addressed enough. I don't know, obviously I'm part of that, very much that, but that sense of, okay, what are the structures? And obviously it's very individual to a certain extent, but that can be put in place to kind of sustain one, and that be really pragmatic, kind of financial sustaining, but also kind of emotional sustaining, and especially in terms of the sort of instability of being freelance and what that means. And that was something that, I think I knew quite early on that I wasn't great at that, that kind of actually I did work kind of commercially for a while, worked with Weber Represents and editorially, not very much. But I think I always knew that actually it wasn't just necessarily the instability, but actually responding to other people's briefs. I'm sort of slightly terrible at it. And working that quickly, I think I sort of realized, and I think I kind of also realized that I'm perhaps better at, or enjoyed more, I don't know if better at, kind of working within a kind of teaching exchange of ideas framework. And that really, when it's working with people like yourself, that was like, oh my goodness, you'd be like, I can't believe this like 20-year-old or whatever, comes every week with like this new bag of contact sheets that are just mind-blowing, and you're not even sure if like they realize how good they are. And like, and that is so humbling and kind of incredible to be a tiny part of that journey, and just to be like, wow, like it's just a reminder also of the kind of power of our medium, and that, and seeing the really early stages of that, I think is something that
I get a lot of pleasure out of that as well when I see people that I've worked with like 5 years ago. Just like it's so inspiring, like working with people and kind of it's like crawling inside their brains.
Exactly.
But you're also so academic as well. So do you like use your writing as well to kind of make a living? And how does that kind of feed into your...
Not really in a way. I mean, yes, of course, it's all, and we have 2 more questions that will come to in a moment in the chat, but I think in a way, so just for the audience that doesn't perhaps know some details of it. So in a way, my trajectory was that I kind of fell into teaching almost like slightly by accident. So had part-time teaching positions quite early in my 20s in Brighton University, and then UAL at LCC for kind of over 10 years, and worked in California for a year as a visiting professor before moving to the RCA a few years ago, but fully. But I think what I sort of realized was that combination of making kind of work quite freely without the sort of perhaps commercial selling constraint, or the kind of commercial photographic commission constraint, that the sort of academic role would allow me that freedom, and that I in a way realized I wasn't great at thinking about, okay, how do I make artwork to sell it, which I think probably no artist really should think about in that way, but also need to. So I think for me, the writing is a part of the making process, and of course always what I've been excited about teaching. But I don't kind of take writing commissions generally, you know, in terms of I don't write reviews of shows, and I'm not kind of hugely interested in that form of writing to do it myself. I'm very interested in, of course, of reading it and so forth. So I think for me, yeah, the space of writing and making is almost one, like very much like you were kind of describing in terms of almost thinking about ideas coming together and how the image making and the writing kind of informs one another.
So
And the
do you
teaching,
make the majority of your money through teaching, and then
absolutely now. Yeah, no doubt. I make a kind of loss, quite frankly, in terms of the kind of form of making practice is incredibly expensive when I'm like shooting 16mm films. But also increasingly I work with grant funding, you know, so that's something that I wasn't great at sort of younger, and that now where I'm kind of supporting a whole family, I used to put all of my salary back into my own work, and that isn't sustainable anymore because I'm, you know, just and kind of family and so forth. So now it's very much that I try and kind of work also with grant funding, and obviously also do work with commercial galleries with flowers who are brilliant, but it's not, but absolutely now I do have a full-time academic job that has research time within it. So it has generous research times where you're kind of paid to make work in the studio. And so in that way, it's all kind of interconnected. And one of our questions is about upcoming shows and events and where they can see more of our work. So I have a talk at the National Portrait Gallery in May. That's I'm not sure if I just posted that, if that went anywhere. That's May 23rd. It's a lunchtime talk on Thursday that I'm excited. I haven't finished writing, but I'm excited to, it's very much about the space of the darkroom, and it's in response to Julia Margaret Cameron and Francesca Woodman's work and the beautiful show on at the moment at the NPG about the space of dreaming. So it kind of takes some of my writing that I've been working on that looks at the space of sleep and dreams, and the dark room. And yeah, we'll be sharing some of the work that I showed, but much more also film work and responding to the exhibition. But Laura, how does someone go about getting a one-to-one with you, Laura? That's a great
drop
question.
me an email.
Maybe put the
and also there's also a prize for the best question. So anyone that has asked a question, please drop me an email. Is there a way, can I write my email? Would that
I think you can go answer live, and then
put it
God, I did it. I'm not sure how to do it actually.
Okay.
Need tech help here.
Okay, well, my email is laura.pannack@gmail.com, or if people Google my name, they can find
I'll post
it.
on the chat. Okay, hold on. If we put it on the chat, then Photo London team will put it on.
Nice.
And there's a final question. Also, Laura, do you have shows coming? I will have a show at Flowers the coming year, but we don't have dates set yet. And I'll also have a monograph coming out, but don't have.
I want to ask you about that monograph. And my question is to you, is your work is such an experience. Like, that's what I love about seeing your work live, is that, you know, the way that you use the space. I mean, you know, you sometimes have live music, and you can often walk around your work, walk into your work. How is that going to translate into a monograph? And
I think that's what I find quite difficult with the book space. Obviously, we've been working on really like material ways in which paper and different, but it's not a catalog in that it doesn't have, or the way I imagine it is not that it has like installation documentation. It's very much about thinking about the sort of fragments of the photographs. It does have writing though, so it has different essays that come out of PhD in writing since then over the last 10 years that kind of are both theory and fiction, how those are interwoven, because that hasn't really been published in a kind of joint form yet. But that is why it's quite difficult. I'm trying to bring all these pieces together. Yeah. But there's
when it's coming out.
No, let's not put a date on that. Yeah. And there's a few other, there's like group shows of Photographiska, and I don't know where it's gone to now, Tallinn, and but yeah, in terms of London, the next one will probably be Flowers. Yeah, are there places, and then possibly Paris Photo, but not, I think. Well, just in terms of Flowers, yeah, installation.
Yeah. What have I got? I've got Belfast Photo Festival. That'll be fun.
Oh, that'll be cool. Beautiful.
Yeah, I've got something in France coming up, which is part of a festival. What else? I'll put it on the Open Doors newsletter. My gallery newsletter will have like loads of stuff coming up, and I know, so I have a news page on my website as well, so I post everything on there.
Brilliant, brilliant. And I think there's a final question that's really interesting from Yanis, is talking about, yes, I love the title Love and Silver. Was it Love and Silver, Flesh and Silver, Blood and Silver, Blood and Silver.
Well, yeah.
And in general, the titles that you select for your work, i.e. Into the Woods. Can you tell us a bit about the role of titles in your work and how lyrical they are?
Yeah, I guess I think my writing is quite playful and quite sort of organic. And so for me, it's kind of what I hope is, again, to kind of touch upon that idea of kind of mystery, but also relationships. And I love work that kind of takes us beyond with the text as well. I don't think an image should ever rely on the text, or the text should ever rely on an image. And I think that, I keep saying I think that. I guess I just listen to my gut with things like that. I'm a big fan of people like Wim Wenders and you know, people that use text in a really kind of lyrical way and thought-provoking way. So for me, it's also a nice way to add a bit of personality or some intimacy in the work. And the project that I did at uni for my degree show when you were there, Esther, was called The Untitled. And it was around the time that teenagers were just getting such a bad stick, like hoodies had come into fashion, and people were just scared of teenagers. And so I took images over the space of a year of teenagers from disabled schools, people referral units, boarding schools, kids I met on the street, everywhere. And then I left each one untitled apart from the name of the young person in the image. And the idea was that you just saw Gemma or you just saw Mike, and you didn't attach these labels. And I think that perhaps the power of writing and imagery is about what we strip away rather than what we put in. So yeah, don't know if that answers your question.
I think that maybe brings us to a good closing point. Laura, do you think? Just, I'm aware of time and that.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, I could chat to you forever, Esther. Like,
totally.
Yeah,
exactly. Well, thank you, everyone, so much. And Laura, thank you for such a special invitation. It's been such a pleasure, as always, to have a chat and to share work together. It was really special. So thank you, everyone, so much. Thank you, Photo London, for the invite. And yeah, Laura's email, for those of you who are interested in one-to-one mentoring, was posted by Photo London into the chat, so everyone can take that down if you'd like to. Yeah. Thank you so much. Have a great evening. Take care. Bye.